Welcome to Transformation 2.0, the podcast for change leaders. My name is Chamara, and in each episode, we bring you real conversations with executives, innovators, and experts who are shaping the future of business. Whether you are leading a team, scaling a company, or navigating the challenges of transformation, this podcast will provide you with insights, strategies, and inspiration to drive meaningful change. Join us as we explore what it takes to lead, adapt, and thrive in an ever evolving world. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Transformation 2.0. I have with me today Sangeet Paul Choudary, who is an international recognized strategist, author, and an advisor on platforms, ecosystems, and AI, a best selling author of Platform Revelation and Platform Scale. His work has been featured on Harvard Business Review top 10 must read 4 times. He has advised CXOs at more than 40 Fortune 500 firms, sits on multiple Fortune 500 advisory boards, and was named World Economic Forum Young Leader, Global Leader. His latest book, Reshuffle, explores how AI transforms work not by automating tasks, but by rewiring organizational coordination. So, in terms of the podcast today, thank you again for coming on the show today, Sangeet.
Thank you, Chamara. Glad to be here.
So, we're gonna talk a little bit about the episode today, focusing on how AI, why AI should not be viewed as simply as a tool for automation, but rather as a coordination technology that reshapes how organizations work. So we're going to be drawing on some of Sangeet's book Reshuffle and also my own expertise around transformation strategy and the discussion around how to reframe AI as a system level shift, similar to how shipping containers revolutionized trade or barcode reshaped retail. Obviously, the intent is for the audience to gain insights around how AI redistributes roles, decision rights, and accountability, creating new strategic battlegrounds for around coordination. Together, we are going to examine which firms, leaders, and industries are best positioned to win the next future of business in terms of looking at transforming their own businesses or disrupting industries and bringing new businesses into the market. So obviously, Sangeet, I want to start, by with a little bit of introduction to your book. So, if you were to introduce your book to the audience today, how would you best describe Reshuffle in terms of what matters around the book's concepts themselves, and obviously maybe giving a little bit of a background about yourself as well?
Well, I think the key idea of the book is that today we think about AI largely as a way to speed up tasks in our existing frame of work. So we think about the impact of AI as doing what we do faster, cheaper, better. We don't really think about its impact in terms of how we could reimagine our business around it. And when we think about our business, the key idea that the book actually proposes is that the impact of AI plays out at every level of an economic system. First and foremost, it changes the nature of competition at the level of an industry or an ecosystem, because whatever was the basis of competition yesterday could get commoditized once AI comes in. If your basis of competition was structured around hiring highly trained talent and training them to do certain types of knowledge work, and now some of that performance of knowledge work can be achieved using AI tools, then that basis of advantage goes away. So the first impact that AI has is at the level of how companies compete. Yesterday's advantages could get eroded, fundamentally new advantages could emerge. What that then leads to is that the way organizations have to be structured in order to compete in this new environment completely change, because organizations typically are not set up just to give jobs or just to hire people. They are set up to compete, and so when the rules of competition change, the nature of the organization changes as well, and that then changes which jobs get valued. So the mistake or the misconception that we often have is we think that AI impacts jobs because it impacts certain tasks that people perform by either automating them or augmenting them, but really primary and much larger way AI impacts our jobs is by impacting the industries within which those jobs sit, changing how companies compete in those industries, and then changing what kinds of capabilities companies will value accordingly in the new frame of competition. So that's really the key idea, that you can't think about AI's impact at the level of individual tasks alone. The entire economy is about to shift.
Thank you for that, Sangeet. So I guess I mean the current rave is around how organizations can drive X percentage of productivity and X percentage of efficiency to be able to actually do everything that they are doing faster and cheaper and hence be more competitive, right? And that's why they're saying those using AI will take away the jobs of those not using AI, right? To me, I think that's a little bit of a misconception at the same time. And I think what you articulated is a nice way of actually looking at it from a more systemic and industry perspective, Sangeet. So if you were to really analyze that dimension around, doing something at X percentage faster or X percentage cheaper in terms of productivity and efficiency versus looking at an industry and looking at a different way of doing business. Let's take a couple of industries as an example, right? So let's take manufacturing, right? And if we were to look at manufacturing as an industry and then look at that and think about how could, for example, let's take something even more concrete. Let's say auto manufacturing, right? So when it comes to auto manufacturing, it becomes a lot more real in terms of how people see it. That we need to bring certain things as part of the supply chain. We need to put it together and we need to build it and we need to ship it, right? So in terms of how AI would transform manufacturing or auto manufacturing, what would be the difference between an approach that a BMW or a Mercedes would take based on their established market position today versus how some of the new entrants like BYD or Xpeng or some of the Chinese car makers are doing, right? How does that differ? How is AI helping them versus compared to how AI adoption is happening in the more established automakers? How could we navigate that conversation?
Well, in order to kind of have a frame to think about these topics, we need to kind of take a step back to really think about what does strategy mean and how does AI change that. And this is something that I talk about extensively towards the end of the book. Strategy is fundamentally an answer to two questions. Where do you play and how do you win? What's your playing field and what's your advantage within that? Now, what happens is that traditionally, our playing fields were very structured. You played in a certain industry, in a certain geography, targeting a certain kind of consumer. Today, industry boundaries are fluid, and you can have convergence from many different sources. So it's not just AI. AI is one of the many factors that's driving that convergence. AI drives that convergence in particular because a lot of industry specific intelligence can now be available across industry boundaries. For example, you could train a model on data in one industry and use it across industry boundaries in another industry. I mean, that's what enables, for instance, insurers and car manufacturers to figure out fundamentally new ways to innovate around insurance because they're essentially taking uh, knowledge from one industry and packaging it, providing it in another. Now, if we take the example of automotive that you mentioned, which is quite interesting, it already sits at the convergence of four different. um I would say systems of capabilities. So one system of capability is just around the car itself as it stands today, in terms of its motion, in terms of its logistics, and so on. The second system of capabilities is around the energy. So it's the electrification value chain kind of converging, which has its own sets of issues. How do you create complementary charging infrastructure to ensure that the driving range of a car is large enough? The third system of capabilities is around connected vehicles. So the car producing data and that leading to services, which can then enable a larger ecosystem of players who use that data to deliver services both not just to drivers but to the larger ecosystem, mobility ecosystem around them. And then the fourth system of capabilities is where AI becomes most radically evident, which is around the act of driving itself, and which is where autonomy and self-driving starts coming in. Now, because we are looking at this, and I deliberately raised the question further away from AI because there are multiple convergences that are playing out, which will set the basis for what companies should do. Uh, because we are talking about these four different systems of capabilities that are converging, the way an incumbent approaches this versus the way a new entrant approaches this is very different, because an incumbent, like BMW in this case, has developed deep entrenched capabilities, but only around one of these systems of capabilities, not along the other three. So, very often, what they end up doing is they try to seek partnerships, they try to seek external capabilities that will help them accelerate their approach to market. However, what often happens when you also need to take into account that both AI, battery technologies, and you know um, when I say AI, not just the autonomy part of it, but also the analytics part of
Yeah.
it, all of these three are rapidly are sources of inputs into this converging value chain that are rapidly, mutating, rapidly improving, heavily funded. And because of this, you can't necessarily rely on an external partner to manage all the capabilities. So if you really look at new entrants that have succeeded, whether it's Tesla or whether it's BYD, they have all been able to do so by vertically integrating across these systems of capabilities and very selectively choosing where they want to open and commoditize and work with partners externally. And so I think that's something that's really important, because there are two things simultaneously happening over here, which are larger than the AI story in itself. One is the convergence across multiple value chains, and the second is really the fact that the rate of improvement of the inputs is so high that you need to be vertically integrated into the inputs in order to constantly translate that improvement into the performance of the eventual car. And this is something that I talk about in the book as well. There's a difference between using any new technology, including AI, as a tool that you bolt onto your business and that you partner and buy from outside, versus using it as an engine that you deeply integrate into, try to own so that you're not dependent on somebody else's engine, and you essentially evolve your proposition around the capabilities of that underlying technology. And so I think automotive is a very good example where it's not just AI, it's not just analytics, but it's also, energy, battery technology, all of these things which are improving at such a rapid pace that you need to be vertically integrated to really squeeze out the benefit into your product and onto the end customer.
Thank you, Sangeet. And I think you addressed the crux of what I was expecting there, which is that vertical integration. And I think the four systems of capabilities coming together. That's definitely true around automotive. And I think it's just more the systemic change that's being driven, right? And I think to me, the reason why I brought AI as an example is because AI is kind of like the current buzzword currently for everyone,
Sure.
right? And then it's easier to talk about it in terms of how it adds value to organizations. And I think where we tend to take a lens around the customer conversations is to actually not just to think about AI as something that you bolt on. It's more about how do you actually reimagine your business. If we were to start from scratch as a new business, how would you think about it? And I think that's where I think that vertical integration. What's a core capability? How does that help you to reimagine and recreate a business that's actually AI native, as opposed to
Right.
trying to build a business around sorry, add AI around the existing business. And I think that's where I really see the value in that thinking. So thank you for explaining that. Maybe just going back to that, task centric versus system centric conversation
Mhm.
we started on earlier. So you spoke about the four systems that are coming together in the automotive world, right? So if you were to take some of the other industries that are going through similar changes with multiple
Yeah.
capabilities transforming, I think the other one that I see a lot of changes in is probably healthcare, right? And maybe if you were to apply the reshuffle lens onto an industry like healthcare, what would you say are kind of the four major areas of capabilities that are shifting in terms of the healthcare industry?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would in general apply this framing, and we'll rapidly apply it, to two or three industries to make it tangible. But the way I would generally think about it is that every industry has inputs. Traditionally, the inputs have been commoditized. Commodity inputs and value has been in creating products with those inputs and taking them to customers. So every industry has inputs, it has production, and it has distribution, right? Um, Now, what's changing at all those three ends is at the bottom end, the nature of inputs is changing because the traditional inputs used to be commoditized. Today, inputs are the best funded. So, AI, for instance, is an input into every industry. You can leverage AI capabilities to reimagine your value proposition. So, it's an input into any product proposition that you're going to create. If you move closer to the customer, it's no longer distribution, but you have to think about the mechanisms by which you gain a strong position in the customer journey. So its distribution is insufficient. Owning the ability to influence customers and owning, if possible, the ability to actually orchestrate the market becomes key. And that is, really what I talk about in my previous books, Platform Revolution and Platform Scale, that it's no longer about distribution, it's about orchestrating the market. But even with AI, it's also about reimagining how you manage the customer journey, because traditionally customer journeys did not have the ability to embed intelligence at the rate that you can embed them today. Traditionally, if you were using a product and something went wrong, you would call customer support. Well, with AI, it's possible that you could embed the intelligence of customer support directly into product usage so that you never have to reactively call product support at all. Or you could have an assistant embedded in there who can constantly troubleshoot your product usage. And so the nature of the customer journey changes, the nature of the input changes. And because we're in a world where there is increasing convergence across different systems of capabilities or industry boundaries, if you will, you have to constantly think about, in the production side, how do you keep recombining and innovating? So recombinant innovation becomes very important. So if you just think of these three things: accelerating inputs, customer journey influence, and recombinant innovation in between, you can apply that lens to any industry and see, how things are changing. Let's take, the example of healthcare, as you mentioned. Healthcare, for instance, the customer journey is completely changing. Earlier, that entire customer journey was bounded within something called a healthcare provider's physical facility. Now that customer journey is managed across connected devices, remote services, orchestrated networks of caregivers. So there's a lot of the customer journey of care and wellness that happens beyond the traditional limitations. Secondly, the nature of the inputs have changed. AI is most obvious, but there are many other inputs that are changing as well. AI, for instance, changes the economics of drug discovery, and that becomes an input into the healthcare value chain that changes how drugs are discovered, how fast you can recover your investment on drug discovery, because AI has reduced the risk associated with it, and how that changes the economics of the drug as an input into the value chain. All of those things start impacting the value chain as well. If I take a different example, completely, separated from all of this, let's take, something like the plastics industry, right? Now, in the plastics industry, the convergence is happening between um, um, sort of the sustainable, system of capabilities that help you become sustainable, because there's a lot of um, global um, requirement to get to sustainable practices with plastics. System of capabilities that help you create circularity. So sustainability can be achieved in multiple ways. It can be achieved in how you decarbonize the processes and so on. Circularity is about not just ensuring reuse, but also creating a tight loop between supply and demand. If you can create a circular loop for your customers, then you get to own that demand in the long term, because you are guaranteeing that you'll take over their post-use usage plastics and make it ready to be reused in future. And so thinking about the convergence of those systems of capabilities along with digitization, because if a plastic compound, if a new compound can carry, or new material can carry sort of a digital passport with it, which uh, clarifies what it is compliant for, what it has been tested against, what its genealogy of development is, then it can be it can reduce verification cycles downstream, and procurement and design can happen much faster because all of that is digitally, it's captured in a digital twin that's moving with the compound. And so you again see, in a completely different industry, which is supposed to be fairly physical, if you will, and fairly dumb, if you will, traditionally, you see the convergence of these three systems of capabilities that open up completely new ways of innovation in that industry.
Nah, thank you for going into that. I appreciate the details that you provided around that. And I think when you're thinking about it, what was coming to my mind was this LinkedIn interaction that began with one of the posts from Usman Sheikh about the Shine's business model. And I was just thinking about what you shared in that in terms of comments going into like how Shine's got this bad reputation because of some of the practices they are adopting at the moment. But at the same time, what you're saying here is actually like the capability that we need to actually address some of those is already there, but it's just that we
Right.
haven't actually really gone down the path of addressing them, right? So if Shine were to actually become more socially conscious and more ethical, if you were to use the term, then they could actually be looking at how to solve some of these systemic problems that are caused around their business model as well. So if you were to really think about it, like what else? I mean, we're just sort of thinking out loud here, right? If you were to think about how Shine's business model the challenges that are caused by Shine's business model could be addressed through what you just described, what could that look like, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, so you raised this point about ethical. I'm personally more a believer in incentives than in ethics. You can create good behavior not by uh, teaching people how to be good, but by creating the incentives that reward good behavior. And
Completely
I
agree
think
on
if you want,
that.
right?
Yeah.
If you want to do this at a systems level, if you want to transform entire economic systems, you have to do it with incentives. So I think the challenge is to some extent also show me the incentive and I'll show you the behavior, right? In the case of Shine, their incentives are very structured around rapid cycles of fast fashion, and because the cost of rejecting cheaply produced goods is fairly low, while the opportunity cost of missing on the next fast fashion cycle is very high. The incentives for them are not wired towards creating sustainable practices. If somebody had to come in and transform Shane to be a more sustainable business, I would say uh, you would have to first work out what's the economic incentive to do so. The problem is a bit like, the challenge of misinformation on social media. The cost of generating lies is zero. The returns on generating lies is very high because it leads to more clicks, it leads to more outrage. The cost of verifying information is very high, and the returns are uncertain. So there are no incentives for social media players. It's not a question of ethics. You can set up an ethics board, but there are no incentives to actually make it happen. In the plastic example that I gave, if you were a plastic supplier, you would have the incentives to do a lot of these things because for you, the economic incentive is that your plastic adoption should be high downstream. So if you could embed sustainability information so that it reduces procurement cycles and reduces compliance cycles downstream for your customers, that's immediate economic benefit for them. And so suddenly sustainability information, etc., becomes something that carries an economic benefit with it. And if you could then also create that circularity loop where you take plastics away from downstream and bring it back upstream, and then make it production grade for specific types of use cases, and you become the guarantor that even though you've recycled plastic, the new compound that you're bringing out is actually reusable and is fit for use, and meets the right specifications, then you've sort of locked in the demand. So there are incentives in there that are naturally baked in. And I'm not entirely sure whether it's a very straightforward path for Shane to reject its current incentives and move in a direction where it, adopts some of the things that we talked about.
And absolutely, I think what you said there made very good sense, Sangeet. And I think where what my thinking is actually like in certain regions of the world, there are social pressures that actually drive organizations to be more socially conscious and have socially more ethical behaviors in terms of how they do business. But at the moment where Shine operates, that pressure is not there, so there's no incentive for them to actually be uh, adopt that. But if you were to really think about, like, if they were to go to certain regions of the world where that pressure is there, without having that socially conscious ways of operating, they'll find it hard. And obviously, if you go to regions like European Union, obviously if they don't have that behavior, they'll actually get fined, right? Because European Union is quite heavy about finding organizations that doesn't operate within their mandates or their rules of engagement, right? And I think that's where that social pressure will come in to address for organizations like Shine when they try to actually scale to other parts of the world. And I think just coming back to where we are talking about, who wins the reshuffle, what organizations or what industries kind of going to be positioned better. To me, I think like where I see is, so in socially conscious areas where circularity is has a strong focus, where ethical operations has strong focus. And I think that's where organizations start to look for, how do we actually create that circularity, how do we create circular business models in terms of trying to reduce waste or trying to optimize the usage patterns in terms of going from just consumption to maybe subscription based models and things like that, right? So do you see things like that coming into play in terms of what you talk about in reshuffle?
Well, I think my I'll get back to the central to one of the central points I make in Reshuffle in terms of how you think about where winners and losers come from, and the the key idea is that in order for you to identify where winners and losers come from, one thing that differentiates those who actually win in the new system or with a technological shift are those who reimagine their business around what the new technology makes possible. I'll take three different examples which might help bring this to life, right? The first example I'll take is Adobe versus Figma. When the cloud came in, Adobe, which was a pre-cloud company which had built its business around selling desktop software, moved to the cloud, and it did a very good job of moving to the cloud. Its stock dramatically expanded because it successfully shifted from one-time licenses to subscription, shifted to cloud-hosted software. Despite all of that, Adobe today struggles against Figma, and that is because Figma reimagined design around what the new technology made possible. So if you look at Adobe, the fundamental thing that Adobe cannot do, which Figma has done, is that Adobe's entire business has always been structured around the logic of a file. A designer works on a file, and that file is then passed on to other people, and they work on it. So even when you move to the cloud, it's still structured around the logic of a file. Figma realized that with the cloud, you could reimagine design and structure it around the logic of an individual element in a file. So every element in a file is a separately addressable component that can be managed. Now, why that is important, I mean, all of that might sound technical, but the reason that is important is because in an enterprise, design is not something that is an individual activity and that is done only by a designer. Design is actually an enterprise-wide workflow activity, which means that you have to manage consistency of design, you have to manage collaboration around a particular design. What Figma allows you to do is you can because it's cloud hosted, you can all collaborate around the same file. So it's no longer the designer you are serving alone, you're serving everybody else. But more importantly, because it's structured at the element level, you can now manage governance of elements across the organization. So if a button has to look a certain way across the organization on a PowerPoint, on the website, then that button can be managed at the level of an element. If you were using Adobe, you would have to keep on replicating that button every time. And that might sound like a simple thing, but organizations fundamentally manage their costs by setting up good governance structures, and that is what Figma enables them to do. So the point I'm trying to make is what enabled Figma to be successful was the fact that it restructured how design works because it restructured it around the capabilities of the cloud. Another example I take in Reshuffle, which applies, which brings this home to AI very well, is what happened with social networking. In the mid 2010s, Instagram, YouTube were the dominant, content-based social networks, and the prevailing idea was that it was very difficult to unseat them because for a social network to work, you needed to have your social graph. You needed your followers. So people would not move to a new social network unless they had followers over there. And so that was the dominant idea. Now, what TikTok did when it came in was it made the logic of the social graph completely irrelevant. Just like Figma made the logic of the file irrelevant and shifted to the element, TikTok essentially is structured around the idea that you don't need to have followers to get benefit from TikTok, and you don't need to follow anyone to see the right content. We'll just start showing you content. The content is going to be only 60 seconds, at least that's the case when it was launched. And because it's going to be bite-sized, in every session, you'll see multiple chunks of content. We'll track everything you do with that content on the phone, and we'll use all of that to create a behavior profile for you. And on the basis of that, link you to other content pieces of interest. And through that, as you get more engaged in different forms of content, eventually you'll follow people. Eventually, the social graph will come about. So the point is that the traditional moat of a social network, that you can't start a social network unless the users have their social graph, was completely broken out by TikTok because it restructured it around what AI made possible. That is, you could now create a new kind of network around the behavior graph. And just to wrap this up, right, the final example I'll just take, which also illustrates this, is that at some points, the right way to transform might be to not adopt the technology at all and to rethink what your capabilities really are about. And a good example of this is actually what happened with what happened with the camera industry when, phone-based cameras came out and photo sharing started happening. So very often we think that the reason Kodak failed is because even though it invented the digital camera, it did not go right ahead, and so it was a slow incumbent. And we talk about all of that, but actually Kodak was not a slow incumbent. It had adopted digital. In 2006, it was the number one digital camera seller. The challenge was not adopting digital. The challenge was where the value was, because even though it was the number one seller of digital cameras, digital camera was actually a commoditized business. It used to make money on film, and now it could not make money on film. And then when the iPhone came out, even its printing business went away. So value in photos had shifted to sharing, and that's where Instagram and other players started capturing that value. There was no way Kodak could have captured it, which and even though Kodak went bankrupt, what happened to Fujifilm actually shows how certain sometimes incumbents should respond. Fujifilm realized that even though it had been in the business of photos, its capabilities were really in chemicals and film. So instead of persisting with, how do we now think about being the camera provider of the future, they looked at their capabilities and asked themselves, what new problems can we solve using our capabilities in chemicals? And so they entered with that, pharmaceuticals. They entered cosmetics, where the same chemistry capabilities could be applied. And so I think that's a really good analogy to kind of think of just adopting the tools and adopting the technology just because new technology is coming is not sufficient at all. You have to either reinvent yourself, or if you're not even thinking about the tech, think about what new positions you could take across fundamentally new ecosystems.
Now, when you're talking about that, that really makes sense. What was going through my head was this Steve Jobs quote. I think, like, Steve Jobs made this quote. If you ask the customers what they want,
Hmm.
and by the time you make it and bring it to the market, they would actually want something else, right? And I think, like, he made the example that it was Henry Ford that said, if you ask people what they wanted, they'll say they wanted a
Sure.
faster horse, right? So I think, that's the way we need to start thinking about, the transformation in this sense, right?
Right.
Don't think about doing the same things by applying new technology, but rethink, how you would actually start from the ground up, right? That's what you're saying. To me, that makes a lot of sense. I guess maybe just going back to the implications for change leaders, what I want to bring home is more around, like if I am a change leader that's thinking about driving the business transformation of my business, what are the different ways change leaders could apply some of the principles of your book and rethink, in terms of how they need to reimagine their businesses? What are some of the areas that you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that I would start with is that the leaders should clearly make a distinction between technology adoption and business model reinvention around a new technology. They are two fundamentally different things. Everybody adopts technology, but very often technology adoption is not where you will actually find advantage, because everybody can adopt technology, and the advantages get commoditized away quite rapidly, even if they are there for a short time. So it's very important to think about that, and not just tick boxes around technology adoption. The second piece is to uh, really rethink whenever there's a significant shift in the landscape, whether because of technology or because of certain other factors, to take some time to step back and rethink, what does this mean for who you are as a business? Does your current strategic positioning still make sense? Has it weakened since since before this change happened? Do you need to reimagine what your strategic positioning should be? And so, with the examples that we talked about, whether it's automotive or healthcare or plastics, and diverse industries, all those companies have to reposition because their traditional models can get commoditized. If your model is based around the fact that cars will always run on fuel and will never be connected to the internet, you might lose advantage. If your model is based around healthcare happens within the walls of a certain institution, again, you may miss out on a lot of value that's sitting outside. So you need to rethink, what does your positioning look like, and do you still have value in that positioning, or is value moving somewhere else? And if value is moving somewhere else, make those bets and rethink what the new positioning looks like. So one of the very fundamental things that I'm essentially bringing out over here is that you might win, but it might require a fundamentally new identity. Your business as it stands today may not win just because it adopted technology. Companies that are resistant to making those hard choices will find it increasingly more difficult. The third thing that I'll just point out is that there are two schools of thought on where competitive advantage in industries is headed. One party believes that industries are getting more concentrated than ever. You have, the S&P 500 is more concentrated than ever before, and so competition is going away, or industries are becoming more anti-competitive. The other party believes that because change is happening all the time, you only have transient advantage. You'll have advantage for some time, and then it'll change again. I really feel that what separates the winners from the losers is how they straddle both sides. You need to keep looking for transient advantages, but you also need to see how you can bake that back into more permanent advantage that stays on and compounds over time. You cannot keep shifting with every new technology coming in. You cannot keep changing your identity every time and keep jumping on the latest bandwagon. So you need to make these choices with the view on, what are our core capabilities, which ones do we uh, continue to code around, which ones do we abandon, what new capabilities do we bring in. So really think about what it takes to keep on um, uh, compounding around a core base that you had. So I think those things are really important when we are looking at a fast changing technological landscape. Think about it at the level of the system. Don't stop at technology adoption. Think about what that means in terms of compounding advantage, and think about what it means in terms of what your identity is as a business.
No, thank you for that, Sangeet. And I think like what you're talking about is more that explore, exploit, dual mode, right?
Right.
So yeah, one is about, yes, we need to constantly keep be seeking about where to bring new areas of value creation for the organization. Look at it, take a more holistic industry-wide perspective and think about how you can identify new areas of value creation. but don't think about it as just as a new thing that you're going to create, but think about how are you going to bring it into the organization and harmonize it alongside your existing business and continue to exploit for the long term, right? So when you're taking a bet, take a bet in a way that it's not taking you away from the business that you're currently in into a completely new industry that's nowhere near where you have synergies and complementarities, but explore areas where you have complementarities so you can actually bring it into the core business and exploit in the long term. So actually you have capabilities that you can sustain alongside that. That's what you're saying. And I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of the thinking we have in our methodology, as well as in terms of how we drive our conversation with the change leaders. Just maybe taking a step into the future look in terms of how AI native structures will redefine industries, and for the next decade. What do you think is the kind of like the core tenet of what how leaders need to think about it in terms of as the sort of the key principle?
Um, well, if you're thinking about, um, how to think about what the new structure of business would look like with AI coming in. One of the points that I make is that you need to um, you need to have less of an AI strategy in the sense of let's see what we can do with AI, and more of an ecosystem strategy around AI, which is now that AI comes in, how do the rules of the game shift or change in the entire ecosystem, right? And probably a good example to drive this home is the transformation of Shutterstock as a company in recent times. So, if you look at Shutterstock, it has always been in the business of licensing, photos. And you would imagine that with Midjourney and with all these AI models coming in, the licensing business should actually go away. Anybody can generate a photo whenever they want, and yet it's not quite as simple as that, because in order to get photos that are perfectly on brand, you need to prompt it really well. If somebody actually already prompted and created great photos, why would you not want to leverage that? And so, what Shutterstock has done has been quite interesting. It's kind of rethought every part of the value chain, not from the perspective of, what should Shutterstock look like as an AI company, but how does, what is Shutterstock's role in the photos, in the photo licensing ecosystem now that AI has changed certain fundamental factors, right? So
It's
it kind
reduced the
of,
cost of creation, but the value of that artifact that you create is still there, right? And then if you,
yeah,
especially if you
so
can.
yeah, I mean, they make changes at various different points. So, first, because they have this library of stock photos in place, they figured out how to use that to train models. And then they've created mechanisms by which the owners of the photos can be recompensated for all of that training. Secondly, they've shifted focus away from the fact that it's not just access to photos, it's really the ability to use photos with the right rights in place. And so rights management has become sort of the underlying layer, rights and license management. So what they've now done is, even if you generate a photo using AI tools, you could license it through Shutterstock and make it available with all the rights management capabilities in place. So they're essentially trying to reimagine the ecosystem they were already playing in, now that photo generation has become cheap. Whereas somebody who was only in the business of licensing photos would see AI as a direct threat and try to see, well, what do we do now that photo licensing does not make money? So Shutterstock clearly realizes that they were never in the business of licensing photos, at least not in recent times. They were really in the business of managing the licensing and the rights of digital assets. So that business still stays, and that's why, knowing what the identity of your business is and how it changes when your ecosystem is changing is very important.
No, that's a good point around what you mentioned about Shutterstock. That made me think about how Shutterstock could actually be applying that into other industries, because this the concept of managing rights is actually applicable not just for photos, it's applicable for video, it's applicable for music, right? So Shutterstock could potentially actually move into these as complementary business areas in the future, because the capabilities that they're building now is actually equally applicable in those areas as well. And I think like one of the things that we look at in our work is, Sangeet, this concept of the traditionally the organizations build this large organizational structures to drive efficiencies, right? And that's how they became competitive. That's how they became leverage the economies of scale, right? And I
Sure.
think one of the things that I spoke about with Venkat was he speaks about these economies of scale, speed, and scope, and how that's changing with AI and the technology that's becoming available to us. From that perspective, I feel that there's an element of the organizational structures that are actually changing in the future as well. In terms of what you think about in Reshuffle, do you go into that aspect of how do organizational structures themselves would change in the future? Is there an aspect that you navigate into?
Yeah, a fundamental point that I make is that organizations have always had what is called what I call in the book a trade-off between autonomy and coordination, which is that if you make teams too autonomous, it becomes difficult to coordinate across teams to get work done. If you put too much effort on coordination, then that creates bureaucracy, which prevents teams from getting work done internally. So there's always a trade-off between the two, and the challenge is that the mechanisms to resolve these trade-offs are very ancient. They are called meetings. Every time you want autonomous teams to work well better, you pull them into meetings where they can share information, share their knowledge, drive towards common goals. All of this creates a tax on the organization's resources, because the tax shows up in multiple ways. There are highly qualified people who are spending time doing documentation so that other teams can have access to their knowledge. Highly qualified people are spending time sitting in meetings because they don't have access to the right information. And very good work is not getting done because they don't know where the information is in the organization. So a point that I make is that, with AI, there's a possibility for us to move away from this trade-off, because if you could train a model on the entire knowledge of the organization, which is present in unstructured formats, and really 5 years back could not have been used effectively, but today can be used to train a model. Um, could you then create an institutional brain for your organization which directly feeds into workflows? So if I'm working across the organization and I just work alongside this brain, if there's an co-pilot or assistant or whatever you want to call that, that directly feeds off this brain and works alongside me, um, does that help me avoid a lot of that coordination and even feeding into this brain, right? Traditionally you would have to do all the documentation, and maybe now you don't need to do that because AI can take unstructured inputs and make it consumable and structured, and create synthesized outputs that can be used by others. So all of that effort that would go into documentation goes away as well. So a lot of what we think of as knowledge work coordination is about to get eliminated or eased out if organizations implement this in the right way internally. So I believe that we are at the cusp of a very important organizational transformation because of AI.
Nah, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. And this is one of the things that we believe in as well. And this is what a lot of our work is built around as well, Sangeet, because we feel that the focus on looking at the existing roles and applying AI to actually get that productivity and efficiency, it will get you 10%, but it won't help you get that 10x improvement. To get that 10x improvement, you really need to rethink about it in terms of where are the areas where there's waste that you could actually eliminate using AI, where are the areas where there is things that are not necessarily needed at the moment with the technology that's available, and then think about how do you eliminate them from the work that needs to be done, and that's the thinking we have. So what you mentioned aligns quite well with what our thinking is as well. Just going into the closing in terms of key takeaways for execs and innovators, I think the concepts that you brought about and how we addressed in the automotive industry and the transformation that's happening there, that's quite crucial and that's quite pertinent. And I think how we looked at what's happening in retail with Shine, what's happening in healthcare, that's quite important as well. Is there anything else that you would want to add to that?
Well, I think the key thing is that today a lot of executives or a lot of workers in general have think about issues at two levels. What is AI doing to my job, and what is AI doing to my industry? And very often they think about that as two disjointed issues. But the key point that I want to talk about, and the key point I make in Reshuffle, is that they are deeply interrelated, because what will happen to your job is less about what AI does to your job as it stands today. That might be the 1 year, 2 year outlook on your job. But over the course of the next few years, what will happen to your job is primarily an outcome of what AI does to where value sits in your industry. So if you're not going to be looking at that, uh, and if you're going to be looking at that only as a way to think about company strategy and not about your own career strategy, then you're sort of missing the point. So you have to think about the larger systemic change to really think about what it means for you. And so I think that that is, the history of technology adoption. We've repeatedly seen that eventually jobs get impacted not because of automation alone, but because of how the entire system changes around a new technology. So that's what I would say, as a comment to leave listeners with. That's what you should be thinking about today.
Thank you for that, Sangeet. And I talk about sometimes these three waves of change that's going to happen. One is that this productivity focused change, and then the two is actually more of these businesses getting disrupted. That's causing massive job losses, and then the third aspect is actually like new industries appearing because of the reshaping. And I think thinking about that in terms of the how to focus on where you want to move into next. That's kind of like what I talk to a lot of customers as well as individuals that I interact with. And I think what you mentioned aligns quite well with that, because that to me is not just about looking at what you're doing today, but think about what's happening to the broader industry, but think about where do you want to position yourself in the future so that you can be in a winning position irrespective of what happens to the business that you're working in today, and make sure that you're positioning yourself well in terms of what the future role for you is, but at the same time in terms of where you want to help your business as well. So thank you
Sure.
for sharing that, Sangeet. I really appreciate you reaching out and expressing your interest in appearing on the podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you for that, and I look forward to having more interactions with you and talking about some of the things that we do more. And as a passing note, I want to say thanks again for appearing today.
Great. Thank you, Chamara. Appreciate it.
That's it for today's episode of Transformation 2.0. I hope you found insights that will help you lead change with confidence. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us bring more transformational stories to leaders like you. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn, and if you have a topic or guest you would love to hear on the show, let us know. See you next time.